So as I promised you, we will be talking about visual politics and the global pandemic here. And again, the format is lightning talk or elevator talks about the papers in the special issue. And then, I'll have some, big idea questions to throw at the panelists. So for this first panel, we have Scott Brennen, Viorela Dan, Thomas Powell, and Damian Trilling. And I propose that we go in the order in which they appear in the program and in which I have listed them. So if Scott is ready, the floor is yours for your elevator talk about your paper.
Sure. Thanks. Okay, I'll try and do this in 90 seconds. So this article is one that I wrote with Felix Simon and Rasmus Nielsen. And it's called Beyond Misrepresentation, Visuals and COVID-19 Misinformation. And basically, we wanted to know both how visuals help frame pieces of misinformation about COVID, but also what other sort of functions that visuals serve in those pieces of misinformation. So we looked at a corpus of about 100 pieces of misinformation containing visuals from the early part of the pandemic that had been rated false by independent fact checkers. And besides doing a framing analysis, we ultimately recognized three different functions that visuals serve in these pieces of misinformation. First, illustrate and selectively emphasize in a sort of like kind of classic framing kind of way, both in mundane ways, there's a claim about cigarettes, here's a picture of a cigarette, but in ways that really help support particular frames. Second, in about half the pieces of content, visuals we saw served as explicit evidence for claims made. And mostly this is done either by kind of misrepresenting visuals as something that they're not, or in manipulating them. But only in very simple ways, right? These are not deep fakes, right? They're what like Data and Society would call like cheap fakes, right? They use very simple, video editing or image editing tools. So for example, like there's one that involves like a rail tanker that has been photoshopped to say COVID-19, right? It's meant to furnish this very direct evidence of this like global conspiracy transporting the virus. So third, we saw visuals being used to impersonate authorities, government or health authorities. Now, why do you care about this? Well, on the hand, the study is sort of one of the first kind of systematic look at visuals and COVID misinformation. But second, really suggests that we need to kind of look beyond the just kind of representational aspects of visuals to see how they help kind of construct claims and misinformation. This is, of course, something that visual scholars are very familiar with. But I would say that too often kind of scholarship in misinformation is sort of stuck in a very kind of representational heavy framework. All right, thanks.
Brilliant. Thank you, Scott. And now I hand over to Viorela.
Yes, thank you. Hi. So my name is Viorela Dan. I'm with the LMU Munich, and the paper featured in the special issue was co-authored with Florian Arendt from the University of Vienna. It's one on visual cues to the hidden agenda. So what we've done there was report the results of an experiment that we have conducted online. We started from the observation that politicians seem to hide cues to their ideology in the background of images of themselves. I'll give you an example. For instance, the leader of the area, the minister president, where my school is located, keeps posting images of himself on social media in which Christian crosses are shown in the background, regardless of the topic at hand. So it does not have to do anything with religion, but we get to see crosses in the background all the time. So what we wanted to know is whether this matters or not. And we found that it does. People are actually able to infer somebody's ideology based on the subtle backdrop cues used, and also they are able to adjust their intention to vote for that person accordingly. So we conclude that subtle backdrop cues are both good and bad. They are bad because they can be used to manipulate audiences, so they are not explicit. And they are good because citizens at least have the chance to know more, at least if they pay attention to the cues, and to know more than politicians are telling them explicitly. Thanks.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. Excellent job. And now, Thomas, please.
Hi. So my name is Tom Powell. I used to work at the Amsterdam School of Communication Research. Now I work at TNO, which is the Dutch Applied Science Organization. I'm published the paper in the special issue along with Michael Hameliers and Tony van der Meer. And it was called Selection in a Snapshot. And basically, the key aim of this paper was to get a better understanding of the role of visuals in selective exposure, but in an environment that is closer to our news reality, our selection environment. So previous studies had, for example, looked at the role of images in selection into political versus non-political news. So, for example, entertainment or sport. They've also more recently looked into the role of visuals in partisan selective exposure, so into attitude congruent or incongruent content. But no study yet looked at how these things interact with one another. So the role of visuals in a richer environment in which you see both political content of different viewpoints and different stances, but also non-political news. So what we did was set up an experiment in the context of gun control news and refugee news in the US. We presented participants with a number of different news feeds, kind of social media style news feeds. And there we manipulated the presence of visuals on non-political news items and political news items of different stances. And we tried to basically pick apart selection behavior and the extent to which visuals drove selection behavior into non-political content and political content of different stances. We also had an effects part of the study where we measured emotional responses to different news items and also issue agreement. And basically the key findings were that you need to pay attention to visuals in the selection context. So when images were placed on non-political news, they were significant distractors away from that meant that people selected less political content. A second key finding was that when you add a political image to an attitude congruent news item, it leads to more attitude congruent selection. And similarly, if an image is added to a issue incongruent item, it leads to more avoidance of that item. So basically, visuals give cues that lead to increased partisan selective exposure. Those two things are fairly normatively negative, but we found a somewhat more normatively positive finding too. And that was regardless of the issue stance, visuals in these news items when people went on to read them led to more issue agreement. So people can change their attitudes in line with cross-cutting news. And that was it in a nutshell.
Thanks very much, Tom. And finally, we have Damian.
Yes, hi. So first of all, funny to speak directly after my former colleague. Hi, Tom. So I'm presenting a paper that I did together with Tom Dobber and Nadia Mitoui and Casey Fraser, all colleagues of mine. And well, in one sentence, we actually found that if you make a deep fake that is meant to discredit a politician, that works. But it only works if you target it to the right people. So essentially what we did was we produced a deepfake that discredited a Christian politician by actually showing him making jokes about Christ's crucifixion. And we then actually found out that if you actually show this to voters of a specific party that are highly religious, then actually that negatively affects the evaluation of that politician. But if you actually do it to only moderate religious people, it doesn't work. If you do it to people who would vote for even more Christian party, because we have a multi-party system, it doesn't work because they don't care anyway. So the bottom line is that when we think about the effects of deepfakes, we actually need to consider that not as a uniform thing that we still kind of do as if we were in the 1950s where we thought these things about television and so on, but that we really need to think about like how is this actually used in combination with micro-targeting or other forms of targeting. And then we actually had a very, very nice side finding, and that is basically as some kind of manipulation check, we wanted to know whether people actually got that it was faked. And a lot of people actually doubted the credibility, but almost no one doubted it because of technical things. So we thought that people thought, oh yeah, they will recognize that the lip movement is not completely synchronous. But everyone who actually said, well, you guys probably faked this, actually commented in the free and open answers that they would not believe this person to have thought that. So that means that actually the heuristics for evaluation are actually more on the content than on the technical features. I think that actually might be a very interesting insight for moving on, actually, to see like, well, if we're talking about literacy, about recognizing these things, is this actually about about the technical things, about knowing what it is, or is it actually going via different routes that we might have not considered? That's it.
Thank you. Thank you to all the panelists. You did a great job at summarizing your work. So, I would like just, to ask whoever of you wants to answer, when it comes to, the visual representation of COVID. And I understand that some of you, have done research on this and published it in the special issue, and some of you haven't, but are, obviously acute observers of reality. In light of your own work, what aspects have stood out to you? And, if you had 48 hours to your day and 14 days to your week, what kind of research would you like to do? Or, are you doing any research on COVID-related visuals that you think is going to enlighten our understanding of these aspects?
Well, if no one is taking it, I'm taking it. No, I'm the one who's actually maybe least expertise on it. Because I did not study images that I encountered, but we actually did an experiment. But what I really actually would think we should maybe study and should focus on is actually something that relates very much to my interest in the dissemination of information. I would like to know if we look at faked or manipulated images, and that doesn't need to be a deep fake or something. It can also be like what has been said before about actually just very simple Photoshoppy things. What actually explains why this kind of stuff is spread? Why do people share that? When do they share that? And what kind of manipulative things actually, well, propagate and which ones do not? I think that's actually a pretty crucial question.
Yeah, interesting. If I can follow up on that. Something that I would be fascinated to study is conspiracy theories and belief in conspiracy theories surrounding COVID. Obviously, QAnon has gained a ridiculous amount of traction. Also, surprisingly, along with the riots that Eric mentioned at the start in the Netherlands, conspiracy theories has got a surprising amount of traction in the Netherlands. A lot of some studies of this seems to point it towards certain accounts that are, for example, associated with spiritualism on Instagram, a very visual platform. And now I see, in my understanding of conspiracy theories, is that it's about telling a story to explain a very, very uncertain reality that we live in now. So, I'd be fascinated to take a look at that and to see to what extent visuals have contributed to telling these stories. And I think that kind of study would be an awesome way to combine some qualitative methods, but also with effects methods.
Thank you.
Yeah. I'll jump in next. I guess I've taken a lot of notes on a lot of things to say, but just to sort of first address, to kind of respond to what Tom just said. I think that's a super interesting area, absolutely. But I've done a little bit of work on 5G conspiracy theories, and I think what kind of stands out to me there, and I think what has been kind of said a lot about QAnon in particular, is it's not just the sort of like narratives that are told by images or in general, the sort of narratives told about explaining sort of different events in the world. There's a really important element of and say like the do-it-yourselfness, right? Like the choose your own adventure, the play along, it's about open interpretation, right? And it really invites people to extend the conspiracy theory, to find their own connections, right? Do your own research. That's why that's such a kind of key refrain across a lot of these conspiracy theories. I think it's going to be really interesting in the way that visuals really kind of allow that sort of, interpretive flexibility that kind of plays into the way that these conspiracy theories kind of play out. But otherwise, I did want to kind of go back and kind of answer Cristian's question a bit more, just kind of to step back a little bit and just think about, for me, what are the sort of images that have really kind of come to mind when I think about COVID misinformation, and what does that say about kind of my research on misinformation, kind of more generally. So I think first for me, I think when I think about it, it's like the visual kind of landscape about COVID has really changed over the year. At first it was all these like really visceral images, of like trucks with dead bodies and insides of hospitals, or people people sick, and now there's, and again, this is sort of just anecdotal, but there seems to be so much more of an emphasis on sort of like almost like a scientific discourse, right? You open up any news app and it's like charts and graphs. I think now in terms of like the New York Times like tracker every day, but I think what's important about that is just in the way that in my own work, like on COVID misinformation, it's really important to recognize how the claims have tracked over time and they've really evolved, moving from like a real focus on like political authorities and how so misinformation about the actions of governmental authorities, to now, right, it's so much more about like vaccines. I think we have to sort of recognize that there's something really important about the way that like visuals have translated over time. Okay, I'll stop talking now because I can just go on. But,
thank you.
I can continue. What I would be very interested in knowing is who gets to decide what is truth nowadays. I've been conducting a couple of interviews with fact checkers in Germany, and I'm currently expanding to the US and seeking to get interview partners from there as well. And picking up on Eric's points regarding whether we are asking maybe too much of journalists and maybe too much of teachers too. What I'm finding out is that that there is an immense burden on their shoulders, and that they are struggling with the notions of related to truth in the pandemic, and that they are sometimes considered to be like the last place where people go to find the truth.
Thank you, Viorela. I have another question that I would like to ask, unless Tom, did you want to say something? No, sorry. I have another question I would like to ask, and then we already have some very interesting questions in the chat, and please keep them going. We'll spend the last 10 minutes or so discussing these. There is, the pandemic has resulted in a call for social scientists in particular, but all scientists and experts to, step up and make a positive contribution. And I think, one of the things that, we're being asked to help with is, how to help, governments and health organizations improve on, compliance with lockdown measures, and in particular, now that thankfully vaccines are being rolled out, improve people's take-up of a vaccine. And I was wondering if, based on your own research and other research you've seen, what are the key lessons that we can learn in terms of, what, public interest organizations and public bodies should be doing, and what they perhaps shouldn't be doing to facilitate a swifter uptake of vaccines and, more pro-social behaviors and all these kind of things that we know are crucial in our ability as a society to fight against this virus. Small question, I know.
I can start this time. I think what I would be personally very grateful for would be if we could stop showing people choking while getting tested and people getting the vaccines all the time. And whatever, of course, I'm primed and I always pay attention to that. But whenever their expression is changing or whenever they look like they are going to throw up, I don't think that's going to increase people's willingness to get a test if they are afraid of pain or get a vaccine.
That sounds like a very good point. And Elizabeth in the chat mentions that this actually started in TikTok, apparently, or at least, it was one of the places where this idea of showing people choking started. So again, that's an interesting consideration about the interaction between social media, traditional media, and so forth.
what I'm going to say now is maybe a bit controversial, but like all these things that we were studying, right? Like micro-targeting and faking stuff, personalization to the extreme, that's all very, very negatively connotated, right? But one can actually turn around some of these techniques for the good, I think. I think one could actually think a bit better on how to actually personalize messages about, for example, compliance with COVID measures, about getting vaccinated. So we might actually be able to offer more insights on which techniques, without actually trying to lie or something, but where we actually might be able to offer insights on how we can actually tailor messages better. And because there are more computational tools available to actually also do that on a larger scale without actually having to handcraft everything, we might be onto something there, I think.
Yeah, great idea, Damian. Yeah, that sounds like I was going to suggest, for example, because visuals have the property that they are particularly good at evoking emotions and then stimulating behavior. I was going to suggest, for example, showing the consequences of not complying to certain behaviors or maybe not taking up vaccines, but with the consideration that you perhaps want to avoid fear appeals in a large way. So I like Damian's solution, tailoring to people's needs. Another idea I had, at least at the start of the pandemic, was using games actually to try and encourage compliance with social distancing norms. So what I had in mind, and I included this in a proposal, was actually to gain points or incentivize keeping distance from one another, whilst creating some kind of virtual environment in which people could increase their interactions. Something I had in mind was like a Pokemon Go style kind of game, but maybe slightly more serious. But it's also linking up with Scott's comment about the interactivity of visuals, that, as a tool.
Tom, speaking of the game component, I don't know if you're aware of this. The Austrian government has a campaign, public campaign, a public communication campaign, where they try to tell people how much 1 meter or 2 meters means in terms of keeping distance to one another, and they do that by asking people to imagine that a baby elephant has to fit in between them and the next person. So maybe, I don't know, whenever you would meet that criterion, you would get points.
Is there a lot of baby elephants walking around Vienna?
Can I just say something to that? It was actually not the idea of the government. It was the idea of a public relation agency, and the government just picked it up. The government was lucky that the public relation agency was not employed by the government, came up with this thing. Okay, just to.
I'll jump in really quick. So I guess I should probably say as a disclaimer that I am, don't really consider myself a visual scholar, but also like I'm not an expert in communication and as like a professional communication, although I spend a lot of time talking to them. And so I think I've realized just how like much thought goes into like crafting these sort of communication campaigns, and I just realized how incredibly hard it is. But I guess like 3 things I wanted to say about this. So first, kind of building off of Damian and Tom's points about the necessity of kind of, or like the value maybe in like micro-targeting. I do think it is really important when we talk, at least in the realms of like talking about combating misinformation, that like we need to recognize that like there isn't a single problem of misinformation or disinformation, even about COVID, that like you have a whole lot of different problems, and they have, right, like misunderstanding the risk about the vaccine is different than like radical conspiracy content, and the way that we address those different populations is radically different. And I think honestly our expectations about being able to change people's minds need to be radically different. Like there doesn't seem to be a lot of evidence that like you can actually make a meaningful difference in belief in conspiracy theory through any sort of like simple communication intervention. But we can kind of maybe make some good, do some good by providing better information. The other things, I think it is you know, as far as I can tell, like a lot of the sort of advice coming out, at least from like the UN and the WHO about how to like craft better messages for like vaccine hesitancy, it always comes down to like empathy and like speaking to local, like rooting it in local, in like where people are, like in terms of like speaking to their, you know, like rooting in like their own social networks or like their local communities. And I've struggled a little bit to sort of think about how visuals can play a role in sort of those things. Like how can visuals maybe be a part of crafting of messages that, like, I don't know, like approach people with empathy to sort of understand that sometimes their misinformation or like their poor understandings or their wrong ideas are coming from maybe a good place, or not, maybe not a good place, but at least like try to sort of understand where they're coming from. I don't know, I don't have an answer for that, but yeah, just some things to flag.
Thank you. And maybe this is the right time to bring in a very interesting comment made by Darren Lilliker in the chat. And I should also say that Darren is the co-author of one of the books reviewed in this special issue, together with Anastasia Veneti and Daniel Jackson, Visual Political Communication, which is reviewed in the special issue. So Darren is asking us to consider, you know, whether to some degree, the propaganda that comes out about COVID taps into the fact that you know, a lot of people who are in isolation and who are suffering from isolation are desperate for a way out and prefer to have the certainty that government and media are lying, rather than, you know, the constant uncertainty in their lives of the existence of a virus, and whether that, you know, that has a greater appeal and a greater influence on these people than images of people suffering in the hospitals, which, you know, we're seeing a lot of those definitely in British media. So I wonder if anyone has any ideas about that.
You mean, so just to make sure I got this right, so whether people prefer a certain type of images as a coping mechanism or a certain type of interpretation of the crisis?
I suppose both. I mean, Darren, feel free to chip in if you want, since, you know, we have time.
Sure. Yeah, it's more the two arguments and which one appeals to people more. And it seems that at least in the UK, there's a lot of people who are I guess at the sort of wrong end of the inequality spectrum, who are more likely to believe in the conspiracy theories. And I wonder if it's the anxiety and uncertainty of not knowing anything really in the terms of a virus. What will work? Who knows? No government works. The WHO doesn't work. So they kind of then fall back on this position that if the government and media are lying, then all we need to do is get them out, because that will solve the problem. Because getting rid of a virus is far more complicated and beyond their, beyond normal ability. It's a reliance on so many factors.
I can totally see that. I think it kind of slipped my mind the name of the model, but it's the decision whether to cope with the threat, to deal with the threat, or to deal with the anxiety that people are feeling. And I'm thinking that what you're describing is people trying to deal with the anxiety by denying the situation, and that is from a psychological perspective just much more convenient way to deal with it.
I'll jump in. Yeah, I mean, I think there's something really compelling about that, and I've definitely, you know, that sort of suggestion has been made before, that like that is one of those kind of like underlying, you know, psychological kind of processes going on behind a lot of conspiracy theories. But I guess there's two things I'll say to that. One, you know, looking at sort of like a public or, you know, like big survey data on like trust, you know, we definitely see like a pretty radical decline in trust in like some of the major institutions like the press and the government across like the COVID pandemic, but trust in scientists and scientific organizations has stayed pretty level. And in fact, like looking kind of before pandemic too, like despite the sort of like widespread, you know, crisis in trust that everyone in the world is talking about, scientists has stayed pretty okay, that like people tend to believe in scientists and trust scientists despite, right, like a lot of you know, prominent misinformation about science. So I guess I'll just throw that out. And I guess the other thing is that, like, you know, in trying to, I guess I'm a little hesitant to like try to explain away conspiracy theories about any one thing, and maybe this is just sort of my own kind of theoretical proclivities, but like I don't think that we can explain it as anything other than what it is, you know. So it's like you know, some of the research out there that's like has found that like the best predictor of belief in conspiracy theories is belief in conspiracy theories. Like, you know, it's like if you believe in one, you're going to believe in more, and like you know, sure, there are associations with populism or political ideology, but less than you might imagine. And so, yeah, so I'm definitely like think that that's a great point about like what are some of the like, you know, the crisis meanings and trust that are underlying some of the like the belief in conspiracy theories. But I maybe caution against like, yeah, like seeing these sort of like totalizing explanations.
Just a quick follow-up, Scott, on that. Actually, in Germany, there is at least one study that I can think of that shows that right-wing people, so on the far right, are actually more susceptible to conspiracy theories.
Yeah, and picking up on that, yeah, traditionally we think of people that believe in conspiracy theories of these groups, but I wonder, picking up on Darren's comment, like a hypothesis that, so maybe Darren's hypothesis is that it's easier to lose trust in government and blame the government because we can be more, there's more efficacy, we can do more things about it, we can vote against the government, or we can go and riot maybe. And I wonder, because of these very uncertain conditions that we experience now, whether this group that traditionally was maybe people on the extremes of society has the belief in conspiracy theories, whether that has grown now because of these situational factors that really amplify our levels of uncertainty. And so I wonder whether, to what extent more and more people have been drawn to these conspiracy theories. Like, just for an anecdotal perspective, I can kind of see that might have grown. So that's a thought. A second thing that I'd like to share is that the fact that these kinds of conspiracy theories, looking at that can reduce trust in government, are also things that can be picked up by foreign actors. For example, I'm doing a short project, a very small one, on the ways in which trust in government is targeted by different narratives in Russian news and communication. And it's really very much focused, it's like a network analysis, and you see a lot of narratives that play into targeting, for example, trust in institutions and trust in the media, for example. And I wonder, it would be nice to try and tear apart the extent to which these effects are happening because of propaganda or because of natural environmental factors that we are all experiencing now.
Eric, you had an interesting point in the chat about conspiracy theories and knowledge. Maybe you want to, briefly summarize it for us and see what the panelists think.
Yeah, it was just the idea that there's something kind of, insider about being part of a conspiracy community. It seems to me that is part of the inherent appeal of these communities. What I'm wondering, in light of, say, the grand collaborative program idea, is if academics were a little more public facing, a little more engaged in conversations with the public, and posted more of their results or had more of a voice at the table, whether it's in media, whether it's in other forms of communication, would that reduce or lessen the kind of the appetite for conspiracy, because people would be in the actual know as opposed into the false reality of a conspiracy?
It's funny you should ask that, because I do not always envy the people who became very popular in Germany in the debate surrounding the pandemic. So, you know how journalists tend to go to the same persons over and over again, who tend to say predictable things over and over again. And from what I'm picking up is that they are actually being targeted by conspiracy theorists and so on, and that they are coping with a lot of pressure. So on the one hand, putting this on the shoulders of many more experts, social scientists, would mean that the burden shared by each individual would be smaller. I'm not that optimistic with regard to whether we are necessarily the kind of communication source that conspiracy theorists would pay attention to. So from my understanding, we would be better advised to actually have people who resemble those believing in conspiracy theories acting as a communication source, rather than yet another scientist who is perceived as coming down from the ivory tower and talking to them.
Yeah, I'd agree with Viorela, and the fact that in terms of content of what we're saying, but also the style in which we say it, I think is less appealing than people that write conspiracy theories and contribute to them. People are generally more attracted to negativity and sensational news or sensational content, and I think that's something that we could maybe do better, is to learn to communicate the truth in a more appealing way, maybe in a more visual way. But I think that's in that sense, I do feel pessimistic about Eric's proposition.
I mean, let me add another pessimistic note, if we're on that anyway. So I'm really wondering whether it is a lack of information, even accessible information out there, or whether it isn't more a lack of actually, or a problem of dissemination, or actually wanting to find it. Because I agree that we all still can do better, but if I look at how scientists communicate now compared to 20 years ago, then I think actually a lot of things have improved, right? So a lot of us are on Twitter, a lot of us write a blog occasionally, a lot of us are approachable by the media. So I'm not sure whether the problem can be fully solved, even though we still can do better, maybe visually also, as Tom said. I'm not sure whether that actually basically the side of the offer, or is maybe not that much of the problem. Maybe it is more actually somewhere in the distribution or demand side. I would caution.
Just a quick response. I know we're out of time, but actually, yeah, I agree with people who are almost too far down the path. It's very hard to pull them out of that, or anybody with a really entrenched perspective or belief. So it suggests maybe a front end policy, and some kind of more fact-based approach, whether it's to education, whether it's to some other kind of professional training or technology literacy, that would at least a little more inoculate people to these kind of rabbit holes.
Okay, that seems like a good place to pause the discussion. There are lots of interesting comments in the chat, and please, everyone, keep engaging with it. And also there are some questions for the presenters. And I want to say it's really good to see perspectives and testimonies from all around the world. Obviously, I say this over and over again, this is an international journal. Obviously, research, published research in the English-speaking world is not as international as it should be yet, even in our journal. And those of you who've attended our conference and have heard me talk about this will know that I sound like a broken record about this. But I think at least these events are a good opportunity for us to exchange ideas, for scholars from these areas of the world that are less represented in our English language published research, to develop collaborations, to tell us what's going on in your neck of the woods, and help us understand problems that go way beyond the borders of the liberal democracies, richer countries where most of the research is being done. That being said, thank you all very, very much to the panelists, and I am now very happy to hand over back to Eric for the panel on populism.